The last major focus we're going to have inside of our MCP server is going to be on prompts. Once again, just like we did with resources, we're going to implement a small feature inside of our project, and we're going to use this feature to understand what prompts are all about, just like we did with resources a moment ago. Let me tell you about the feature we're going to add into our program. We're going to add in support for /commands. So for example, I want to have a format command. I've got some screenshots over here of how it's going to work. Whenever a user types in a slash, we're going to list out some number of commands that are supported by our application. For right now, we're going to have just one command called format. So if I type in just slash, I should see a little autocomplete right here, and the only autocomplete option should be format. If I then select format, I should be prompted to add in some document ID after it. So one of our different document names like report.pdf or whatever else. Then, whenever a user runs this command, the goal is to get Claude to reformat this document using Markdown syntax. So in other words, take the plain string that we have without any special formatting tied to it inside of each of our documents right now. Remember, inside of our MCP server, our current document content is just plain text. We want to feed this into Claude and somehow get Claude to rewrite it using Markdown syntax. So I would expect to see some output like this, something that says, I'll help you reformat the document. Claude is then going to use a tool to read the contents of the document. And then finally, inside the final response, I want to see the content of that document rewritten down here in Markdown syntax. Now, there's something interesting about this feature that I want to point out. The real core of this feature, like the real goal here, is to allow a user to reformat a document into Markdown syntax. And that is an operation that actually doesn't require you and I, the developers, to write out any code to implement. What do I mean by that? Well, a user can already launch our CLI and say something like reformat the report.pdf file in Markdown syntax. A user can already do this, no issue whatsoever, and Claude is going to do a reasonable job of it. It's going to take the contents of our document and reformat it into Markdown. And as you can see right here, it worked entirely perfectly. So what are we really doing with this feature? Well, the thought process here is that if we just left this up to users and allowed them to manually type in something like convert this to Markdown, they might get a okay result, but they might get much better result if they had a really strong prompt that is custom tailored for this particular scenario of converting a document into Markdown. So a user might be a lot happier if you and I sat down as the MCP server authors and wrote out and tested and evaled and went through the entire process of developing a really thorough, fantastic prompt, like the one you see on the right-hand side. So again, just to repeat, yes, a user can execute this entire workflow on their own, but if they use this fancy prompt over here instead, well, I think they would be all the better. This is the real goal of the prompts feature inside of MCP servers. The thought here is that ahead of time, we can define a set of prompts inside of our server that are custom tailored to whatever our server is really specialized to do. In our case, our server is all about managing documents, reading documents, editing documents, and so on. So we might decide to add in a set of prompts that are very high quality, that have been evaled and tested, and we know that they work in a wide variety of different scenarios. We can then expose these prompts for use inside of any client application, like the CLI app that we are putting together right now. Now, one thing I want to point out here is that we could develop this prompt and just put it directly into our CLI codebase. That is totally possible. We could do that, obviously. But again, the thought here is that your MCP server that might specialize in some particular task might expose some number of prompts that people can just come and use without having to worry about developing them ahead of time. To define a prompt inside of our MCP server, we're going to write out a little bit of syntax very similar to the tools and resources we have already put together. We will use the prompt decorator, we will add a name to the prompt, and optionally a description as well. Then, whenever the client asks for this prompt, we'll send back a list of messages. These are actual user and assistant messages, so we can take the messages and send them off to Claude directly. All right, so let's go over to our server, and we're going to try putting together our own prompt. And just like you see right here, it's going to be all about taking the contents of a document and somehow rewriting it in Markdown format. Okay, so back inside my editor, I'm going to find my MCP server file. I'm going to go down a little bit to the comment about rewriting a document in Markdown format. I'll delete that to do, and then I'll add in a MCP prompt, the name of format, and a description of rewrites the contents of the document in Markdown format. I'll then add in an actual implementation. So format document. I'm going to receive as an argument a doc ID, and then optionally we can add in a field description here as well, just like we did with our tool earlier on. So I can optionally add in a field with a description of ID of the document to format. And I'm also going to add in a type annotation of string, just to make sure that's really clear as well. From this function, we are going to return a list of messages. I'm going to make sure I add in an import for this base thing at the top right away. So right underneath the existing MCP server import, I will add in from MCP server fast MCP prompts import base. Then back down at the bottom, inside of here, we're going to define our very well tested, very well evaled prompt. I wrote a prompt out ahead of time. I'm going to paste it in like so. So this prompt is just asking Claude to take in a document ID. Implicitly, we are kind of asking Claude to fetch the document ID's contents using the read document tool. And then after getting that document, just go ahead and rewrite it with markdown syntax. And finally, after rewriting it, edit the document as well to save those updates inside of our server. Now, after defining this prompt, we're then going to return a list of messages. So down here, I'm going to return a list with base user message, and I'm going to feed in our prompt that we just wrote out to it, like so. Now I'm going to save this file, and then let's go start up our MCP Development Inspector and test out this prompt from that interface. So at my terminal, I'll run that same command again, and then navigate to that address inside my browser. I'll make sure I connect to my server. I'll then find the prompts section. I'm going to list out all the different prompts that are available to us, and at this point in time, we have one prompt, just format. So I'll click on format, and then I have to enter in a document ID right here. Let's, this time around, maybe we'll put in a document ID of, how about outlook.pdf. So I'll put that in, and then get prompt. And then here is our list of messages. So these have been put together ahead of time. I've got one message part here, so a text part with our full prompt right there. We could see that the document ID was interpolated into it. So now that we have these messages, we can take them and send them off to Bedrock. And hopefully we're going to get back some appropriate kind of response. So once again, the entire idea here behind these prompts that we might implement inside of our MCP server is that the prompts we are defining are going to be well tested, well evaled, really specialized to one particular use case.